It is August 20th, 1940. In a fortified villa on the outskirts of Mexico City, a 60-year-old man sits at his desk editing a manuscript about the life of Joseph Stalin. Behind him, a young man he has known for months raises an ice axe. The blow doesn't kill him immediately. He has enough time to fight back. Enough time to tell his guards not to let them kill his attacker. He wants him to talk. Leon Trotsky dies the following day. He has been hunted across 4 continents for 11 years. And the man who finally reached him was sent by the revolution Trotsky himself had made possible. Before we begin, I want to thank you for checking out today's video. Diving into a historical figure as complex as Trotsky takes real interest, and I truly appreciate you spending your time here. If you enjoyed the story, please like, comment, and subscribe. It's the best way to help other curious minds find the channel. With that said, let's now begin our story on the extraordinary and tragic life of Leon Trotsky, the man who made the Russian Revolution, lost everything he built, and was murdered in the name of the ideas he had spent his life defending. The story begins not in Petrograd or Paris or the frozen exile of Siberia, but in the black earth of southern Ukraine, in a place so remote it barely registered on the maps of the empire that governed it. Yanovka was a farm, nothing more. It sat on the flat, wind-stripped steppe of Kherson province, roughly 40 kilometers from the nearest town of any significance. In winter, the tracks that led to it dissolved into mud and ice. In summer, the dust rose in clouds around the horses and settled on everything: the furniture, the food, the faces of the children playing in the yard. There were no neighbors close enough to visit without planning the journey a day in advance. There was a mill, a workshop, a small house, fields that stretched to every horizon. And there was a family named Bronstein. David Bronstein was the man who had made Yanovka what it was. He was a Ukrainian Jewish farmer, self-made, stubborn, largely illiterate, possessed of the kind of physical and practical intelligence that builds things rather than names them. He had arrived in this corner of the steppe almost from nothing, and had slowly accumulated enough land and equipment to qualify as prosperous by the standards of the rural poor. He was not warm, exactly. He was not a man given to displays of sentiment, but he worked with a ferocity that bordered on the religious, and he expected the same from everyone around him. His wife Anna was the steadier one. The center of the household's emotional gravity, the person the children learned to read before they learned to read anything else. She was more educated than her husband, more given to quiet reflection, and it was from her, or so those who knew the family later believed, that the youngest surviving son inherited his appetite for books. That son was born on the 7th of November 1879. He was named Lev Davidovich Bronstein. The world would come to know him by a different name entirely, one he invented for himself in a Siberian prison cell 20 years later, taken, for reasons he never fully explained, from a jailer who had once kept him locked up. He would sign his first fake passport with it and never look back. The name was Trotsky. The childhood at Yanovka was not unhappy. Exactly. But it was defined by a specific and relentless isolation. There were no Jewish communities nearby, no synagogue within easy reach, no rabbi, no Shabbat table laid with anything more than practical necessity. The Bronsteins were Jewish in name and in the eyes of the Russian state, which meant they occupied a specific legal and social category, one that came with restrictions on where they could live, what professions they could enter, and how freely they could move through the empire. But they were not observant in any meaningful sense, and young Lev grew up with almost no formal connection to Jewish religious life. What he had instead was the farm, the flat horizon, the silence, and a hunger for something he couldn't yet name. He was a peculiar child in the way that children who read too much and talk too fast are always peculiar. He had an extraordinary memory, the kind that absorbs a page and holds it, that recalls a conversation weeks later word for word. He had opinions before he had the experience to justify them, and he expressed them with a confidence that older people found alternately charming and maddening. He was already at 9 or 10 years old, someone who could not be easily managed. At 9, his father sent him away. Not as a punishment. David Bronstein was a practical man, and he understood that the farm could not give his son what the farm could not give. He sent Lev to Odessa, the great southern port city, to live with relatives and attend school. The city struck the boy like a physical force. After Yanovka's silence, Odessa was noise and color and the smell of the sea and languages spoken on every corner. There were bookshops, there were theaters, there were people who argued about ideas as casually as other people argued about the weather. He was enrolled in St. Paul's Rehearsal, a school with a German character and an emphasis on science and mathematics. He was, almost from the first week, exceptional. His marks were the highest in his class. His teachers noticed him. His classmates noticed him too, though not always warmly. He had a tendency to correct people, to push arguments further than social comfort recommended, to win in ways that left his opponents not just defeated but slightly diminished. He was not cruel, exactly. He was simply someone for whom intellectual precision mattered more than tact. He spent 7 years in Odessa, growing from a farm boy into something harder to categorize. He was drawn to mathematics and language in equal measure. He loved Russian literature, Pushkin and Tolstoy and Chekhov, and loved it with the intensity of someone who had been starved of beauty and was now eating without restraint. He also began slowly and almost without noticing it, to pay attention to the world beyond books, to notice who had power and who didn't, to ask why. The question that would organize his entire life began not with Marx or with revolution, but with something much smaller. A local tax collector who came to Yanovka during one of his summer visits home, and who treated his father, a man who had built something from nothing, who worked harder than almost anyone Lev had ever known, with a contempt so casual it barely registered as cruelty. Just the ordinary contempt of someone with a little institutional power for someone without any. Lev watched his father absorb it in silence, and he felt something he would spend the rest of his life trying to put into words. Not just anger, something colder and more durable than anger. The recognition that the world was arranged in a particular way, that the arrangement was not natural or inevitable, and that someone, possibly him, should do something about it. He didn't yet know what. He was 15 years old and far more interested in geometry and Pushkin than in politics. But the question had been placed. It would not go away. It is 1896. Lev Bronstein is 17 years old and has just transferred from Odessa to Nikolaev, a smaller city further along the coast, to complete his schooling. It is here, in this unremarkable provincial town, that the trajectory of his life changes permanently. The change is quiet at first. It begins with a garden, specifically, with the garden of a man named Franz Shvigovsky, a Czech gardener who rented his house to a shifting population of idealistic young people and whose evenings were given over to the kind of extended conversation that was, in late imperial Russia, simultaneously exciting and dangerous. The conversations were about economics, about the condition of the peasantry, about the writings of people whose names the authorities would have preferred to remain unspoken. Marx was among them. So was Lavrov and Chernyshevsky, the great Russian radical writers whose influence on a generation of young Russians was almost incalculably large. Lev arrived in Nikolaev intending to study mathematics. He left it 2 years later as something else entirely. The group around Shvigovsky's garden were not yet Marxists in any rigorous sense. They were, more accurately, searchers, young people who had felt the weight of the empire and were trying to find a language for what they felt. Some were drawn to the Russian populist tradition, which believed that revolution would come from the peasantry, from the vast rural masses who had been oppressed since the time of the czars. Others were beginning to read the German texts that argued something different and more systematic, that it was not the peasant but the industrial worker, the proletarian of the factory, who was the true engine of historical change. Lev arrived skeptical of both. He was 17 and clever and had not yet learned that being clever is not the same as being right. He argued fiercely against Marxism in his early weeks in the group, on the grounds that it was too schematic, too German, too obsessed with economics to account for the full complexity of human life. He would later look back on this position with something between amusement and embarrassment, because what happened, as it always does with the young and the brilliant, was that he read further and more carefully, and the arguments he had been dismissing began to look not like a cage but like a key. It was not the Communist Manifesto that convinced him. It was Capital, the first volume of Marx's great work, dense, demanding, built from an architecture of argument that required patience and good faith to enter, but that, once entered, reorganized the way you saw almost everything. The factory inspector's reports that Marx quoted in such extraordinary detail. The children losing their fingers to machinery, the seamstresses working 30-hour shifts, the systematic extraction of value from living human labor by those who owned the means of producing it. The diagnosis was so precise, so mercilessly documented, so free of sentiment, while being so obviously driven by moral fury, that Lev found himself unable to put the book down and unable to unsee what it had shown him. He was 18 when he joined the South Russian Workers' Union, a small illegal organization that Lev and a handful of friends essentially built from scratch. They wrote leaflets by hand. They distributed them in factory districts. They held clandestine meetings in rooms where someone was always posted near the window to watch the street. They were amateurs at everything, at conspiracy, at organizing, at the basic craft of political action, and they made every amateur's mistakes. but they were serious. Lev especially was serious. He had the convert's intensity, the particular ferocity of someone who has arrived at a conviction through argument rather than inheritance, and who therefore holds it with both hands. In January of 1898, the police came. The arrest swept up hundreds of people across the south of Russia in a single coordinated operation. Lev was 20 years old. He had been involved in revolutionary politics for less than 2 years. He was held in Nikolaev, then transferred to Kherson, then to Odessa, where he spent 18 months in a prison that was cold and damp and full of the smell of unwashed bodies and the sound of people slowly learning what they had gotten themselves into. But it was in that Odessa prison cell that something decisive happened. He read. He read with a discipline and a ferocity that the cell somehow enabled. No distractions, no social obligations, just hours and hours of uninterrupted time with books that were smuggled in through a rotating system of sympathetic visitors and bribes and occasional official carelessness. He read philosophy and history and economics. He began writing his first serious essays on literature, on politics, on the nature of historical change. He argued with his cellmates for hours. He was, by every account, an exhausting and brilliant presence to be confined with. He was also, during these months, falling in love. Her name was Alexandra Lvovna Sokolovskaya. She was 27 to his 19, a serious and committed Marxist who had been arrested in the same sweep. She had been the one, in the Shvigovsky Garden debates, who had most effectively dismantled his early objections to Marxism, who had argued with the patient precision of someone who had thought longer and harder about these questions than he had. He had initially found her irritating for exactly this reason, then he had found her indispensable. They married in a prison cell, with a borrowed ring and a rabbi who was also a prisoner, because they understood that as a married couple they could be sent to the same place in Siberia rather than different ones. The sentence was 4 years of exile. They were transported east in the summer of 1900, first by prison wagon, and then by river barge, moving steadily deeper into a landscape so vast and silent and indifferent to human ambition, that it felt less like a punishment than a philosophical statement about the smallness of human beings. They ended up in a small settlement in the Irkutsk region, hundreds of kilometers from anything that could be called a city. It was here, in Siberia, copying out drafts in the lamplight while Alexandra put their infant daughters to sleep, that Lev Bronstein became Leon Trotsky, at least on paper, in the forged passport he arranged through the revolutionary underground that maintained tenuous contact with even the most remote exiles. And it was here, in the silence of the Siberian night, reading whatever he could get his hands on, that he began to understand that the ideas forming in his mind were larger than he could develop in isolation, that he needed to get to where the argument was actually happening. He left in the summer of 1902. He left Alexandra and their 2 daughters. He left them without ceremony, with the understanding, or so he told himself, that the work required it. He would spend the rest of his life making that kind of calculation. It did not always look better with distance. He was 22 years old, traveling west with a forged passport and an introduction to a man he had never met, whose pamphlets he had been reading in Siberia like scripture. That man was living in London, in a cramped flat in Bloomsbury, working on a publication called Iskra, the Spark, that was trying to organize the scattered fragments of Russian revolutionary politics into something coherent. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and when Trotsky knocked on his door at dawn, Lenin opened it, looked at the young man on his step, and said simply, "Come in." The London of 1902 greeted Trotsky the way London greeted most things, with a damp indifference that was simultaneously alienating and clarifying. He had arrived speaking almost no English, knowing nobody in the city except through letters and reputation, carrying nothing but the forged passport, a small amount of money from the revolutionary network, and the accumulated reading of 3 years in Siberian exile. Lenin was, in person, not what Trotsky had imagined. He was shorter than expected, more physical, more direct. He had a way of looking at you that suggested he was already 3 moves ahead of wherever you thought the conversation was going. He had been living in London for a year, editing Iskra in collaboration with Georgy Plekhanov, the founding father of Russian Marxism, and a small group of other émigrés who were collectively trying to impose some kind of organizational coherence on a revolutionary movement that existed mostly in small illegal cells scattered across the Russian Empire, connected to one another by smuggled newspapers and the occasional courier. He read Trotsky's articles within hours of their first meeting. He sent a note to Plekhanov that same day. A young eagle had arrived. He brought Trotsky into the Iskra circle almost immediately, giving him writing assignments and putting him on the speaking circuit. The Russian emigrant communities of London and elsewhere were always hungry for speakers who could report on conditions inside Russia, who had actually been there recently, who carried the authority of direct experience. Trotsky was an immediate sensation as a speaker. This would remain true for the rest of his life. He had a gift that is rarer than it sounds, the ability to make abstract ideas feel not just comprehensible but urgent. To take a theoretical argument about the nature of capitalist development or the relationship between the peasantry and the proletariat and render it in language that had the texture of immediate reality. He spoke fast. He thought on his feet. He had what a later generation would call stage presence, a quality of complete conviction in the moment, of burning attention focused on the people in front of him, that pulled audiences toward him even when they disagreed with what he was saying, especially when they disagreed. But it was in the editorial offices and the cafes and the long argumentative evenings of the émigré community that the real education was happening. Because Russian Marxism in 1902 was not a unified movement with a clear direction. It was a contested space, full of competing interpretations, factional loyalties, personal resentments, and arguments about questions that were simultaneously theoretical and urgent. Who leads the revolution? What is the relationship between the party and the class? How do you build an organization that can function underground, in conditions of severe repression, without either dissolving into ineffectiveness or becoming a bureaucratic machine that replaces the initiative of the masses with the decisions of a central committee? These were not abstract questions. They were, in a very real sense, the questions that would determine the shape of the 20th century. The split came in 1903 at the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, a gathering that began in Brussels and moved to London when the Belgian authorities grew nervous about the density of revolutionaries on their soil. The Congress was supposed to be the moment of unity, the meeting at which the scattered fragments of Russian Marxism finally coalesced into a coherent party with an agreed program and an agreed structure. Instead, it produced one of the most consequential arguments in political history. The argument was ostensibly about a clause in the party's membership rules, specifically, about whether a party member was someone who accepted the program and contributed regular support, or someone who accepted the program and participated actively in one of the party's organizations. It sounds technical to the point of tedium, but the implications ran very deep. Lenin's position that membership required active organizational participation was in effect an argument for a party of professional revolutionaries, tightly organized, disciplined, with a strong central leadership capable of directing action in conditions where loose networks could be infiltrated and destroyed by the Tsarist secret police. Martov's position, the looser definition, was in effect an argument for a broader, more democratic movement, one that could encompass the full range of socialist sympathy without requiring the kind of commitment that only full-time revolutionaries could offer. Trotsky sided with Martov. He sided against Lenin. He did so with the full force of his rhetorical gifts, arguing in the Congress sessions and in subsequent pamphlets that Lenin's organizational model was essentially authoritarian, that a central committee empowered to direct the party from above would inevitably substitute itself for the party, and the party would substitute itself for the class, and you would end up with a small group of men making decisions in the name of a revolution that the revolutionary class itself was no longer driving. He called it substitutionism, and the diagnosis would prove, in the long run, to be both correct and irrelevant, because the world does not always reward being right at the right time. The Congress produced the names by which the two factions became known, those who had voted with Lenin on a committee question near the end. By a slim and somewhat accidental majority called themselves the Bolsheviki, the majority. Those who had voted with Martov called themselves the Mensheviki, the minority. The names stuck long past the point where they accurately described anything. Trotsky was now a Menshevik by association, though he was already, in his own mind, something harder to categorize. Someone who disagreed with both factions on certain questions and whose real intellectual project was developing independently of either. He was 23 years old, already famous in the small world of Russian revolutionary politics, already marked as someone whose talent was undeniable and whose allegiances were his own. Lenin admired him. Lenin also found him, at this stage, infuriating, someone whose gifts were obvious and who deployed them in the wrong direction with total self-confidence. They were not done with each other, not even close, but for now, Trotsky moved on, to Paris, to Vienna, to the restless and argumentative world of the émigré left, where the debates continued and the revolution remained, for the time being, theoretical. The theory was about to become reality, faster than anyone expected, and when it did, Trotsky would be in the center of it. It is the 9th of January, 1905. In St. Petersburg, a Russian Orthodox priest named Father Georgy Gapon leads a procession of somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people toward the Winter Palace. They are carrying petitions and icons and portraits of the Tsar. They are dressed in their best clothes. They are singing hymns. They believe, with the faith of people who have not yet learned that a certain kind of faith is a death sentence, that if they can only reach the Tsar himself and place their petition in his hands, he will hear them, and things will change. The troops that line the approaches to the palace fire into the procession. Hundreds are killed. Hundreds more are wounded. The day becomes known as Bloody Sunday, and it sets off a wave of strikes, uprisings, and mutinies that shakes the empire to its foundations for the remainder of that year. Trotsky was in Geneva when the news reached the émigrés. He was 25 years old. He crossed the border into Russia within weeks, traveling with a false passport, watching through train windows as the landscape changed, and the distant thunder of the streets began to make itself felt. He arrived in St. Petersburg in time to witness something that had no precedent in the history of the empire. A workers' council, a Soviet, had formed spontaneously in the city, drawing together delegates from factories and workshops and trade organizations, an improvised body of popular self-government that nobody had planned and nobody fully controlled. It was the kind of thing that Marxist theory had predicted was possible, but that everyone, on both sides of the factional divide, had assumed would take years or decades more to materialize. Trotsky threw himself into it. He wrote for the workers' newspapers. He spoke at factories and at outdoor meetings in the volatile streets of the capital. He was not yet a member of the Soviet's executive, but he moved through its world with the particular energy of someone who recognized that this was what he had been thinking about for years, that the abstraction had become concrete, that the moment had arrived. By October, the Soviet had grown large enough and bold enough that it was effectively governing parts of the city in parallel with the Tsar's administration. It issued its own orders. It managed its own affairs. The Tsar, confronted with a general strike that had paralyzed the country's railways and communications, issued the October Manifesto, a document that promised civil liberties and a consultative parliament, the Duma, and that was intended to split the opposition between those who would accept the concession and those who would demand more. It worked to a degree, but it did not end the Soviet. And it was in this period, in November of 1905, that Trotsky became the Soviet's effective chairman, the most prominent and articulate voice of what had become, briefly and precariously, the most significant experiment in working-class self-government the world had yet seen. He was 26 years old. He held the position for 52 days. Then the government arrested the Soviet's entire executive in a single operation on December 3rd. Trotsky was taken with them. He was held through the winter and into the following year, awaiting trial. It was during this period of imprisonment, his second, and considerably more comfortable than the first, that he wrote the work that would define his theoretical contribution to Marxism and make him, in the eyes of many, the most original thinker the Russian revolutionary tradition had produced. The work developed what he called the theory of permanent revolution. The argument was elegant and radical, and it cut across the lines of both the Bolshevik and the Menshevik positions. The conventional Marxist view, broadly speaking, was that Russia would have to pass through a stage of bourgeois democratic revolution, the kind that Western Europe had undergone in 1789 or 1848, before the conditions for a socialist revolution would be ripe. The bourgeoisie would first have to overthrow the Tsar, establish a democratic republic, develop capitalism further, and only then, after this preparatory stage, would the working class be in a position to make its own revolution. Trotsky thought this was wrong. He thought it was wrong because the Russian bourgeoisie was too weak, too dependent on the Tsarist state, and too frightened of the working class to carry through a thoroughgoing democratic revolution. The only class capable of leading such a revolution to completion, he argued, was the proletariat, and the proletariat, once in power, could not stop at the democratic stage. The logic of its own class interests and the pressure of the social forces it had unleashed would push it toward socialist measures, toward the expropriation of the capitalists, toward the fundamental restructuring of economic life. The revolution would be, in this sense, permanent. It would not stop at the bourgeois democratic stage but would pass directly through it and beyond it. But, and this was the crucial second part of the argument, the revolution could not survive in isolation. A socialist Russia would be an island in a capitalist sea. It would face economic blockade, military intervention, the hostility of every established power on earth. Its survival would depend on the spread of revolution to the advanced industrial countries of Western Europe, where the conditions for socialism were genuinely ripe. The permanent revolution was not just a domestic Russian program, it was an international one. He was tried in 1906 and sentenced to exile in Siberia for life. With the additional distinction of being stripped of all civil rights, he was transferred east toward the Arctic, toward a destination so remote it makes the Irkutsk settlements of his first exile look cosmopolitan. He escaped before he got there. It took a few weeks of planning and the cooperation of a Zyrian peasant who drove him in a reindeer sledge across the frozen tundra to a point where he could connect with the underground network. The escape was uncomfortable and extremely cold. Trotsky later described it with a dry matter-of-factness that made it sound almost administrative. He crossed into Finland, then Sweden, then made his way back to Western Europe. The revolution of 1905 had failed. The Tsar had survived. The Soviet had been crushed. The activists who had not escaped were in Siberian prison camps or dead. But the dress rehearsal, as Lenin would later call it, had taught everyone involved something invaluable. It had demonstrated that the working class was capable of spontaneous self-organization on a massive scale. It had produced the Soviet as a model of proletarian democracy that nobody had theorized in advance. And it had given Trotsky, 26 years old, escaped from a life sentence, already author of one of the most significant theoretical contributions to revolutionary Marxism, a first-hand sense of what revolution actually felt like from inside. He would carry that knowledge for 12 more years, until the next one. The years between 1907 and 1917 are the years nobody talks about when they talk about Trotsky. They are the years of the emigre, the years of cramped apartments in Vienna and Paris and New York, of editorial work and faction fights and the particular tedium of waiting for something that might never arrive. He settled first in Vienna, where he and his second wife Natalia, whom he had met and fallen in love with in the emigre circuit, while still technically married to Alexandra Sokolovskaya, established a household that was, in its way, a small creative enterprise. Trotsky wrote. He wrote constantly. He wrote for the Russian underground press and for European socialist papers and for anyone who would publish him. He read voraciously across European philosophy and literature and science. He went to the theater and the opera. He developed opinions about art that were as strong and as carefully reasoned as his opinions about political economy, and he expressed them with the same confidence. Vienna in those years was one of the intellectual capitals of the world, a city where Freud was working out the architecture of the unconscious, where the young Adolf Hitler was painting watercolors and nursing resentments in flophouses, where the café culture sustained a level of argument and counter-argument and artistic ferment that felt, to a young Russian intellectual with no fixed employment and unlimited opinions, like home. He saw Lenin occasionally. Their relationship had cooled since the 1903 split, had never fully recovered its early warmth, and was maintained at the temperature of two people who respected each other's intelligence and disagreed about almost everything structural. Trotsky continued to argue that the Bolshevik-Menshevik divide was unnecessary, that the revolutionary left should unite. Lenin continued to believe that organizational clarity was more important than organizational breadth, and that Trotsky was someone who wanted to stand above the factional conflict without committing to either side. He called him Judas Trotsky in private correspondence, among other things. The relationship was, in the diplomatic language of its time, complicated. The war changed everything. When the guns began in August 1914 and the great socialist parties of Europe, the parties that had spent decades building the Second International, the global fraternity of labor that was supposed to be a counterweight to capitalist nationalism, voted to support their respective governments' war efforts. The effect on the European left was somewhere between catastrophic and clarifying. The International, which had promised that the workers of all countries would refuse to fight each other in a capitalist war, simply dissolved in the face of national feeling. German socialists voted for German war credits. French socialists supported the French war effort. The internationalism that had been the movement's most fundamental claim about the world turned out, in the crisis, to be thinner than anyone had believed. Trotsky was one of the few prominent voices on the left who refused this collapse entirely. He was not a pacifist. He believed that revolutionary violence was sometimes historically necessary, but he was completely opposed to the war as a capitalist enterprise, and completely contemptuous of the socialists who had abandoned their principles to support it. He wrote against the war from Vienna until Austria-Hungary expelled him as an enemy alien in 1914. He wrote against it from Paris until France expelled him in 1916. He wrote against it from Spain until Spain expelled him. He arrived in New York in January 1917, essentially out of countries that would have him, and settled into a flat in the Bronx while continuing to write for the Russian-language radical press. He had been in New York for less than 3 months when the telegram arrived. The Tsar had abdicated. The revolution had begun again. He was on a ship heading back across the Atlantic within days. Trotsky arrived back in Russia in May of 1917. Lenin had arrived in April, having been transported from Switzerland in a sealed train provided by the German government, which had correctly calculated that a Bolshevik-led peace movement was in their strategic interest. The Provisional Government, the bourgeois democratic body that had taken power after the Tsar's abdication, was continuing the war. The Petrograd Soviet, the Workers' Council that had reformed spontaneously alongside the Provisional Government, creating the strange dual-power arrangement that defined the spring and summer of 1917, was pressing for peace. Into this situation, Trotsky arrived as neither a Bolshevik nor a Menshevik but as something in between, the leader of a small faction called the Inter-District Committee, the Mezryancy, which had been arguing for years that the Bolshevik-Menshevik split was artificial and that unity was both possible and necessary. He also arrived with a position that was in its essentials the same as Lenin's. The provisional government had to be overthrown, the Soviets, the workers' and soldiers' councils that had formed across the country had to take power. The war had to end. The revolution had to advance. Within weeks of his arrival, Trotsky had joined the Bolsheviks, bringing his faction with him. Lenin, who had spent years writing unflattering things about Trotsky in party correspondence, acknowledged the situation with characteristic pragmatism. Trotsky had understood what was necessary and had acted accordingly, and whatever their history, the revolution needed him. What followed in the summer and autumn of 1917 was the most concentrated period of political activity in a life that was never short of it. Trotsky spoke everywhere. He was, in the opinion of those who heard him in that period, at the absolute peak of his abilities as a speaker, which means he was among the greatest political orators the 20th century produced, and the 20th century produced several remarkable ones. The Cirque Moderne was a large outdoor venue in Petrograd where he drew crowds of thousands who stood for hours in the summer heat to hear him speak. He spoke without notes, without a prepared text, with a precision and a force and a sense of occasion that left audiences not just persuaded but transformed, feeling that they had been given, for the duration of the speech, a view of history that they could not have found on their own. In September, he was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. He was now in formal terms the leader of the body that represented the working class of the capital city of the Russian Empire. The provisional government was disintegrating. The Bolsheviks had a majority in the Soviet. The question was no longer whether the revolution would happen but when and how. The answer was the night of October 24th to 25th. Not in retrospect the kind of dramatic storming that later legend would require. It was, in its immediate execution, largely an administrative and organizational operation, the systematic transfer of control over key institutions, the railway stations, the post office, the telegraph office, the bridges, the power stations. The Winter Palace was taken more or less last, after most of the provisional government's defenders had simply gone home. Trotsky organized much of this. He had been running what was formerly called the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet, which was in effect the operational headquarters of the Bolshevik seizure of power. While Lenin wrote the proclamations and held the strategic direction, Trotsky managed the practical execution, the orders to specific units, the timing of specific operations, the coordination of a military action in a city of millions while simultaneously managing the political situation that would determine whether what had happened would be consolidated or reversed. On the morning of October 25th, when the Congress of Soviets opened and Lenin stood up to announce that the provisional government had been overthrown and power had passed to the Soviets, Trotsky was standing a few feet away. He had not slept. He was 37 years old. He was, alongside Lenin, the most important figure in the most significant political event of the century. The real work, the impossibly hard work, was just beginning. The revolution that had been made in the capital now had to survive, and survival in the winter of 1917 and the terrible years that followed meant war. The war was, in fact, several wars simultaneously. There was the continuing catastrophe of the First World War, from which the Bolsheviks needed to extract Russia regardless of the cost, and the cost, set at the peace conference of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918, was staggering. Enormous territories of Ukraine, the Baltic states, Finland, much of Western Russia, handed over to the Central Powers in exchange for an end to the fighting. Trotsky led the Soviet delegation at Brest-Litovsk through weeks of agonizing negotiations, employing a tactic he called neither war nor peace, refusing to sign but refusing to fight, that ultimately collapsed when the German military simply resumed its advance. The treaty that was finally signed was humiliating in its terms. Lenin had been right that it was necessary. Trotsky had been wrong that delay was possible. He acknowledged the error and moved on. This was one of his qualities that his enemies later found it convenient to forget. He could recognize when he had been wrong and recalibrate without losing his confidence or his direction. It was not humility exactly. It was something more functional. The ability to update without being destroyed by the update. The harder war was the Civil War, which consumed Russia from 1918 to 1921 in a conflict of almost unimaginable brutality. The White Armies, counter-revolutionary forces backed by British, French, American, Japanese, and Czech military intervention, controlled enormous portions of the country at various points. The Reds had the cities, the industrial centers, and the railway network. They did not at the beginning have an army worthy of the name. Trotsky built one. It is difficult to convey at this distance how extraordinary this was. The old imperial army had dissolved. The Red Guards, who had made the revolution, were brave and politically committed and largely useless as a conventional military force against trained and equipped opponents. Trotsky was appointed Commissar of War and People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs, with powers that were, in practical terms, almost unlimited. He created, essentially from nothing, an army of 5 million men. He recruited former Tsarist officers, military specialists, he called them, and deployed them in command positions alongside political commissars who ensured their loyalty, or at least their compliance. This was one of his most controversial decisions. Many Bolsheviks thought the use of class enemies in positions of military authority was a betrayal. Trotsky argued that a revolution that could not defend itself would not last long enough to worry about its purity, and that competent military leadership was a technical requirement, not an ideological question. He operated out of a specially equipped train, the famous armored train that became, during the Civil War years, his mobile headquarters, his printing press, his court, and in certain moments his refuge. The train carried a telegraph office and a printing press and a library, and a team of secretaries and a staff of military specialists and a squad of guards. It moved constantly along the fronts, appearing where the situation was most critical, carrying with it the combined authority of the Central Soviet leadership and the particular intensity of the man who commanded it. He was not a gentle commander. He could be brutal in the ways that civil wars make people brutal, ordering summary executions of deserters and cowards, demanding standards of performance that exhausted his own subordinates as much as they impressed his allies. But he was also, by the testimony of the people who served under him, someone whose presence transformed situations. Someone who arrived at a collapsing front and somehow, through the combination of authority and energy and absolute refusal to accept defeat, reconstituted the will to fight. The Civil War was won. The intervention was repelled. Russia was devastated, famine-stricken, industrially ruined, its population depleted by war and disease, and the catastrophic violence of what had been, in its worst moments, a conflict without rules. But the Soviet state had survived. And Trotsky had done as much as any single person to make that survival possible. He was, by 1921, the second most powerful man in Russia. Only Lenin was more central to the state. He was also, though he could not have known it then, at the absolute peak of his power. The long descent had already begun. Lenin had his first stroke in May of 1922. He had another in December. By the spring of 1923, it was becoming clear to everyone in the Bolshevik leadership, though not yet to the broader public, and not fully to Lenin himself, that the man who had built the party and led the revolution was dying. The question of succession was not stated openly. It was the kind of question that could not be stated openly, because to state it was to acknowledge not just Lenin's mortality, but the fragility of the entire structure he had built, a structure that rested, more than anyone had admitted, on the authority of a single extraordinary person. But the question was present in every meeting, every alliance, every decision about party appointments and newspaper editorials and the control of the increasingly important administrative machinery of the Soviet state. There were, broadly speaking, three significant figures in the succession question. There was Trotsky, there was Zinoviev, the head of the Communist International and Lenin's closest collaborator during the exile years, and there was Stalin, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, a position that had been created in 1922 and that nobody had yet understood was the most important post in the country. Trotsky underestimated Stalin consistently and catastrophically. This is the great puzzle and the great tragedy of his political life in the 1920s, and it has never been entirely explained. He was not, in general, a man who underestimated people. He had a sharp eye for character and for the way character expressed itself in political action. But Stalin he consistently saw as a secondary figure, capable, diligent, useful in organizational matters, but not the kind of person who could seriously challenge for leadership in a party of revolutionary intellectuals. He referred to him privately as the party's most eminent mediocrity. He would later, in exile, write an entire book about how Stalin had destroyed the revolution, but in the years when something might still have been done, he misjudged. Part of the reason was structural. Trotsky's power rested on his public visibility, his oratorical gift, his authority as a military commander and theorist. Stalin's power rested on something quieter and more durable: control of party appointments, of who got placed where, of the 1,000 administrative decisions that determine whether an organization functions in your interest or against it. By the time Trotsky understood what had been built around him, the building was complete. There was also the matter of Lenin's testament. In December 1922 and January 1923, Lenin dictated a series of notes that have become known as his political testament, documents in which he assessed the major figures in the party leadership and commented on their qualities and limitations. The notes on Trotsky were complicated. He praised his intellectual gifts and his record, but worried about his too far-reaching self-confidence and his tendency toward the purely administrative side of things. The notes on Stalin were damning. He wrote that Stalin had concentrated too much power in his hands, that he could not be trusted to use it responsibly, and that the party should consider removing him from the position of general secretary. These notes were suppressed. The party's central committee, on which Stalin's allies already held considerable influence, voted not to make them public after Lenin's death. Trotsky, who had seen them, did not fight hard enough to have them published. He would later argue that he had been operating under political constraints that made aggressive action impossible. His critics would argue that this was exactly the kind of political timidity that had cost him everything. Lenin died on the 21st of January, 1924. He was 53 years old. The grief was enormous and real, not only among the party leadership but across the country, among people who had little interest in Marxist theory, but who understood that the man who had led the revolution was gone and that what came next was uncertain. Trotsky was not at the funeral. He was in the Caucasus, recovering from an illness, and he later claimed that Stalin had deliberately given him the wrong date. Whether this is true or whether it was the consequence of genuinely muddled communication, the effect was the same. At the moment when visible solidarity with Lenin's legacy mattered most, Trotsky was absent. Stalin stood at the bier. Stalin gave the oration. Stalin positioned himself as Lenin's true heir with a ceremony and a solemnity that was as calculated as it was effective. The campaign against Trotsky began almost immediately. It was not conducted as an open political argument that would have given Trotsky the platform on which he was most dangerous. It was conducted through the quiet machinery of organizational manipulation, the appointment of his opponents to key positions, the removal of his allies, the editing of party history to diminish his role in the revolution and the Civil War. A photograph from which Trotsky was progressively removed became one of the defining images of Stalinist falsification, not because it was the worst thing that happened, but because it made the process visible in the most literal possible way. Trotsky fought back in the only way he knew how, with ideas. He wrote a series of documents in 1923 and 1924, collected under the title The New Course, arguing that the party was becoming bureaucratized, that the revolutionary generation was being supplanted by careerists and yes-men, that the internal democracy that had characterized Bolshevik practice in its best moments was being systematically strangled. He was right about all of this. He was also, in making the argument publicly and in theoretical rather than organizational terms, demonstrating exactly why he would lose. He was defeated in a series of party votes in 1924 and 1925. His allies were scattered or co-opted. His public statements were increasingly restricted. He tried to form alliances with Zinoviev and Kamenev, the two leaders who had been Stalin's partners in the original triumvirate against Trotsky, when they in turn fell out with Stalin and found themselves facing the same treatment they had helped administer. The left opposition, as their grouping became known, was crushed. In October 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party. In January 1928, he was sent into internal exile in Alma-Ata, in Kazakhstan, in what was clearly an attempt to isolate and silence him while avoiding the international embarrassment of executing one of the revolution's founders. In February 1929, the Soviet government stripped him of his citizenship and expelled him from the country entirely. He left with Natalia and their son Sergei. His other son, Lyova, would join him later. The family boarded a boat from Odessa without knowing, in any definite sense, where they were going. They were stateless in a world that was about to become extremely hostile to stateless people. The exile had begun. The first stop was Turkey. The Turkish government, under Kemal Ataturk, agreed to give the Trotsky family residence on the island of Principo, a small island in the Sea of Marmara, a few hours by ferry from Istanbul, famous mainly for its stray dogs and its relative peace. They settled into a house there in February 1929 and stayed for 4 years. It was not a comfortable exile. The house was old and drafty. The local communist movement, such as it was forbidden from associating with the world's most famous communist exile. The GPU, the Soviet secret police, had already begun the surveillance and infiltration operations that would shadow Trotsky for the rest of his life. Letters were opened. Visitors were monitored. Some people who sought out Trotsky on Principo were almost certainly reporting on him to Moscow. But Trotsky worked. He worked in the way that people work when work is the only thing standing between them and despair, with a discipline and a ferocity that his collaborators and secretaries found both inspiring and exhausting. He wrote his autobiography, My Life, in a matter of months. He wrote a history of the Russian Revolution in 3 volumes, a work of enormous ambition and considerable achievement, covering the events of 1917 with the dual authority of a participant who had also thought harder than almost anyone about what those events meant and why they had happened. He wrote political analyses, pamphlets, letters, theoretical essays. He wrote about fascism as it rose in Germany with an urgency that the official Communist International, following Stalin's line that social democracy was the main enemy, almost entirely failed to match. He predicted Hitler's coming to power with a clarity that stands as one of the great political warnings of the 20th century, a warning that went almost completely unheeded. He also, in these years, built the organizational foundation of the Fourth International, the new revolutionary international that he believed was necessary to replace the Communist International, which he argued had been irrevocably corrupted by Stalinism. The project was quixotic in certain ways. Trotsky was trying to organize an international revolutionary movement from a drafty house on a Turkish island. With limited funds, a small staff, and the permanent threat of Soviet assassination hanging over everything he did. His followers were scattered, factional, prone to the kind of sectarian disputes that are partly the inevitable consequence of maintaining principled positions in circumstances of weakness, and partly the occupational hazard of people who are more comfortable arguing than acting. He attracted brilliant people. His collaborators and secretaries during the exile years included figures who would go on to significant careers in literature, journalism, philosophy, and politics across several countries. They were drawn to him by the combination of his intellectual force, his historical significance, and the particular magnetism of someone who maintains absolute conviction in the face of everything the world throws at them. They were also, some of them, working for the GPU. This Trotsky knew, or suspected, and could not always prevent. The losses accumulated steadily. His son Lyova, who had become his closest political collaborator and the manager of his European operations, died in Paris in February 1938 under circumstances that were almost certainly not natural. Admitted to a clinic under a false name, he died following a routine operation in a way that those who investigated it later found deeply suspicious. Trotsky's daughter Zina had died in Berlin in 1933, a suicide. His other daughter, Nina, had died in the Soviet Union in 1928. His son-in-law Platon had been arrested and disappeared into the Gulag. The purges of the late 1930s consumed most of what remained of his old comrades. Trotsky was denied entry to most of Western Europe. France admitted him briefly, then asked him to leave. Norway admitted him in 1935, and then, under Soviet pressure, effectively imprisoned him in 1936, forbidding him from making political statements and monitoring his communications. It was the Norwegian government's way of managing its relationship with Moscow without technically extraditing a man whose extradition would have been a political scandal. He was, by 1936, running out of places to go. It is the summer of 1936. In Moscow, a series of extraordinary events is beginning. A group of old Bolsheviks, men who had been among the founding generation of the party, who had made the revolution, who had worked beside Lenin, whose names were known to every literate person in the Soviet Union, appear in a courtroom and confess to crimes of almost hallucinatory implausibility. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had once been Stalin's closest allies in the campaign against Trotsky, confessed to having organized a terrorist conspiracy directed by Trotsky from abroad. They confessed to having arranged the assassination of Sergei Kirov, the Leningrad party chief who had been shot in December 1934. They confessed to planning further assassinations, to maintaining secret channels with the German Gestapo, to systematic sabotage of Soviet industry and agriculture. They do this in a courtroom, before reporters, in language that has the quality of a script, because it is a script, developed through weeks or months of interrogation, deprivation, psychological pressure, and in some cases physical torture, by the NKVD officers who had been given the task of producing confessions. They are sentenced to death. They are executed within hours of the verdict. The Moscow trials. There would be 3 major ones, between 1936 and 1938, destroyed virtually the entire original Bolshevik leadership. The charges in all of them had one thing in common: Trotsky. In the testimony of defendants across all 3 trials, Trotsky was named as the ultimate conspirator, the foreign agent, the terrorist mastermind, who had organized everything from his exile through agents and couriers and secret meetings. The accusations were specific in their details: meetings that had allegedly taken place, letters that had allegedly been sent, instructions that had allegedly been given, and false in their entirety. Trotsky conducted his own counter-trial from Mexico, where he had finally been admitted in January 1937, thanks largely to the intervention of the Mexican painter Diego Rivera and the government of Lázaro Cárdenas. He had settled into the Blue House in Coyoacán, the home Rivera shared with Frida Kahlo, a bizarre and vivid domestic arrangement that lasted until the personal and political tensions between the 4 of them made it untenable. He established himself in another house nearby, began working again, and began organizing his defense. The Commission of Inquiry into the charges made against Leon Trotsky in the Moscow trials, which became known as the Dewey Commission, after its chairman, the American philosopher John Dewey, convened in Coyoacán in April 1937. Trotsky testified for 13 sessions before an international panel that included academics, lawyers, journalists, and political figures from several countries. He answered every question. He produced documentation. He demolished, point by point, the specific allegations that had been made against him in Moscow. The commission found, in its final report, that the Moscow trials were frame-ups, that the confessions had been obtained by methods incompatible with legal standards, that Leon Trotsky and his son Lyova had been falsely accused. In Moscow, the trials continued, the confessions continued, the executions continued. The truth that the Dewey Commission had established was simply not what the world chose to see. For every newspaper that reported the Commission's findings, there were others that accepted the Soviet version, that found the accusations against Trotsky plausible, that could not bring themselves to believe that a government claiming to represent the working class was capable of such systematic falsification. It is one of the stranger moral episodes of the 20th century, the willingness of a substantial portion of the Western intellectual left to accept, or at least not forcefully reject, the Soviet prosecution of its own founders. Some did so out of genuine belief that the Soviet Union represented a necessary bulwark against fascism that could not be undermined. Some did so out of ideological investment in a version of the world that the Moscow trials threatened to destabilize. Some did so because Trotsky himself was difficult, abrasive, uncompromising, demanding of intellectual honesty in ways that made those who could not meet the demand uncomfortable. He watched all of this from Coyoacán with a controlled fury that expressed itself, as his fury always had in work. He was writing a biography of Stalin, not a polemic, but an attempt at genuine historical analysis of how the man had come to be what he had become. He was developing his theoretical work. He was corresponding with a wide international network of followers and collaborators. He was, in his 61st year, conducting himself with the discipline and productivity of someone who believed there was still work to be done and time to do it. He had about 3 years left. To understand what Trotsky spent his exile years arguing, and why it still matters, you have to understand what he thought had gone wrong. The Soviet Union that existed by the mid-1930s was not, in Trotsky's analysis, a socialist state in any meaningful sense of the word. It was something new in history. A workers' state that had been captured and deformed by a bureaucratic caste, in the way that a biological organism can be captured and deformed by a parasite that does not kill it outright, but bends it to its own purposes. He called it a degenerated workers' state, because the fundamental economic transformation of 1917 remained in place. The capitalists had not been restored, private ownership of the means of production had not been re-established. Degenerated because the political superstructure had been taken over by a privileged bureaucratic layer that exploited the workers economically and suppressed them politically. Stalin was the expression of this bureaucracy, not its cause. Remove Stalin and another Stalin would emerge, or something like him, because the social pressure generating the bureaucracy had not been removed. What was needed was a political revolution, not a social revolution that would overturn the economic foundations of the Soviet state, but a political one that would restore Soviet democracy, restore the rule of law, restore the ability of the working class to govern itself through democratic institutions. The Fourth International that Trotsky was trying to build would be the instrument of that political revolution. He published his major analysis of this situation in 1936. In a work called The Revolution Betrayed, it was and remains one of the most important analyses of the Soviet system produced in the 20th century. It described, with remarkable precision, the mechanisms by which a revolutionary state becomes a bureaucratic one, how the original organs of workers' democracy are gradually hollowed out, how the party substitutes itself for the class, and then the Central Committee for the party, and then the General Secretary for the Central Committee, until you arrive at one-man rule dressed in the language of the collective. The book was also, in certain respects, a work of self-criticism, though Trotsky did not always acknowledge it fully, because the structures that Stalin was exploiting had been built in the early years of the revolution, including by Trotsky. The suppression of rival socialist parties in 1921, the criminalization of factions within the Bolshevik Party itself, the concentration of power in the Central Committee, all of these had happened under Lenin, and Trotsky had supported, or at least not effectively opposed them. He had believed, as Lenin had believed, that the necessities of the Civil War made these restrictions temporarily necessary, and that they would be lifted when the emergency passed. The emergency never passed. The restrictions became permanent, and then Stalin extended them indefinitely. Trotsky's answer to this critique, and he was aware of the critique, it was put to him by his more independent followers, was that the circumstances of the Civil War had made the decisions understandable if not inevitable, and that the moral responsibility lay with those who had transformed temporary measures into a permanent system. He believed, or needed to believe, that the revolution's degeneration was not inherent in its founding choices, but was the contingent product of specific historical circumstances. The failure of revolution in the advanced industrial countries of the West, the economic devastation of the war and civil war, the immaturity of the working class, and finally the conscious agency of a bureaucratic caste that had seized the levers of state power. Whether he was right about this remains one of the central arguments in the history of the left. It is not an argument that has been resolved. The house in Coyoacán that became Trotsky's final home was not the Blue House. He had moved from Rivera's compound following a complicated series of personal and political ruptures. Rivera had broken with the Fourth International, and there had been a brief and disastrous affair between Trotsky and Frida Kahlo that had created precisely the kind of personal turmoil that Trotsky's enemies could use and that his friends found mortifying. He and Natalia moved, in 1939, to a house a few streets away on the Avenida Vienna. They spent the following months turning it into a fortress. The need for fortification had been demonstrated with painful clarity on the 24th of May, 1940. In the early hours of that morning, a group of perhaps 20 men, armed with machine guns, wearing police and military uniforms, their operation organized by the Mexican Communist Party under the direction of the GPU, attacked the house. They fired approximately 300 rounds into the bedroom where Trotsky and Natalia slept. They planted incendiary bombs. They abducted Trotsky's grandson, Seva, who was found unharmed several hours later. Trotsky and Natalia survived because they had pushed themselves against the floor behind the bed as the first shots came through the walls. Neither was injured. Seva had a foot wound from a grenade fragment that turned out to be minor. The leader of the attackers was the Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, himself a GPU agent. He was arrested, released, and eventually allowed to leave the country. The operation had been organized, Moscow later confirmed, as a GPU project. It had failed. The failure required a different approach. The different approach was already in preparation. His name was Ramon Mercader. He was a Spanish communist, the son of a Soviet intelligence officer, trained by the GPU and inserted into Trotsky's circle under the identity of Frank Jackson, a Canadian journalist whose social connections had given him legitimate access to the household through a romantic relationship with one of Trotsky's secretaries. He had been cultivating the relationship for months, visiting the house, becoming a known and trusted face. Trotsky was not without suspicion of Mercader. One of his close collaborators had warned him that the man's behavior was strange, that something about him didn't fit. But the warning had not been acted on forcefully enough, and Mercader's access was not revoked. On the 20th of August, 1940, Mercator arrived at the house with a manuscript he said he wanted Trotsky to read. He sat beside Trotsky at his desk while Trotsky bent over the pages. He had an ice axe concealed under his raincoat. He drove it into the back of Trotsky's skull. The blow was not immediately fatal. Trotsky screamed, a scream that Natalia and the guards heard from across the house, and then rose and grappled with Mercator, biting his hand, fighting back. His guards entered the room, knocked Mercator down, and would have beaten him to death if Trotsky, bleeding heavily, had not intervened. He wanted Mercator to talk. He wanted to know who had sent him. He already knew, of course, but he wanted it documented. He was taken to a hospital in Mexico City. He underwent surgery. He survived the night. The following day, the 21st of August, 1940, he died of his injuries. He was 60 years old. His last written words, found on his desk that morning, were a fragment of the manuscript he had been working on, the biography of Stalin. The fragment ended mid-sentence. The death was the beginning of an afterlife considerably stranger than the life. In Moscow, Trotsky's assassination was treated as a non-event. The Soviet press barely mentioned it. Stalin did not acknowledge it publicly. Mercator received from his prison cell in Mexico. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years, the order of Lenin, through intermediaries. He served the full sentence and spent the rest of his life, after his release, in the Soviet Union and Cuba, honored by the system he had served. In the wider world, the reaction was complicated by the timing. August 1940 was a month after the fall of France, a month before the Battle of Britain began. Europe was in the convulsions of the worst catastrophe in its history, and the murder of a Russian exile in Mexico City competed poorly for attention with the German occupation of Paris. Those who cared about Trotsky grieved. Those who had never liked him found the moment inconvenient in one way or another and moved on quickly. The Trotskyist movement he had spent his last decade building did not collapse immediately, but it did fragment. The Fourth International that he had formally founded in 1938, the year of its founding Congress, held in a suburb of Paris, was always more of an aspiration than a reality. An organization that claimed the authority of a revolutionary international without the mass base that would have given it genuine historical weight, without Trotsky's personal authority to hold its competing tendencies together. The fragmentation that had always threatened it accelerated. Within a few years of his death, there were multiple competing Fourth Internationals, each claiming legitimacy, each denouncing the others with a sectarian intensity that would have been familiar to any student of the history of the left. But the ideas survived. They survived in ways that were sometimes unexpected and sometimes ironic. In the universities of post-war Europe and America, a generation of students discovered the revolution betrayed and found in it a language for describing the Soviet Union that was neither the apologetic of the official communist parties nor the crude anti-communism of the Cold War right. Here was a rigorous Marxist critique of Stalinism, one that did not require abandoning socialist principles to make its argument, that, in fact, made the argument from within the tradition rather than against it. In the student movements of 1968, Trotsky's portrait appeared on the walls of occupied universities alongside Che Guevara and Rosa Luxemburg and Mao. This required a certain selective reading of his legacy. The Trotsky who had suppressed the Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921, who had defended the militarization of labor in the early Soviet period, who had spent years in the leadership of a one-party state, fitted less comfortably on a poster than the Trotsky who had been murdered by Stalin's agents and who had predicted the Soviet Union's degeneration with such uncomfortable accuracy. In the trade union movements of Britain and Australia and elsewhere, Trotskyist organizations built genuine presences, not mass parties, but serious organizations capable of intervention in significant disputes and of producing activists and theorists who shaped the left in their respective countries for decades. In Britain, the Socialist Workers' Party and its antecedents. In the United States, the various formations that traced their lineage back to the Socialist Workers' Party of the 1930s. In France, the Ligue Communiste Révolutionnaire, all of these maintained, with varying degrees of fidelity, elements of the Trotskyist tradition. None of them made a revolution. Trotsky had predicted they would. He had predicted that the crisis of capitalism would eventually generate the conditions for revolutionary change on a sufficient scale that a disciplined revolutionary party would be able to play a decisive role. The crisis of capitalism came more than once. The Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial collapse of 2008 and the ongoing crises of the 21st century. But the revolutionary moment did not follow in the way he had theorized. Why not? It is a question his intellectual successors have been arguing about since his death. Some argue that his theory of the vanguard party, the idea that the decisive factor in a revolutionary situation is the presence of a disciplined revolutionary organization capable of providing leadership, is simply wrong, that it overestimates the importance of conscious leadership and underestimates the capacity of the system to manage its contradictions and the capacity of reforms to diffuse radical energy. Some argue that his analysis of the Soviet Union as a degenerated workers' state was too generous, that it was in fact a form of state capitalism from the beginning, in which the party bureaucracy constituted a collective ruling class exploiting the workers in a way that was structurally equivalent to capitalist exploitation. Some argue that his internationalism was correct in principle, but that he never solved the practical question of how you build international solidarity in conditions where national consciousness remains enormously powerful. The arguments continue. They show no sign of reaching resolution. Trotsky, who spent his life insisting on the urgency of resolving them correctly, would probably find this unsurprising and infuriating in equal measure. There is a photograph taken in Coyoacán in 1940, a few months before the assassination. Trotsky is sitting at his desk. He is wearing a suit that does not quite fit. His white hair is wild above his forehead. His eyes, behind the familiar round glasses, are looking at something outside the frame, something the camera cannot see. He looks like a man who is still thinking, still working out the problem, still convinced that the solution is just beyond the edge of the current page. He had spent 40 years on the central problem of his life, and he had not solved it. He had theorized the revolution and helped make it. He had built the army that defended it. He had diagnosed with painful accuracy the process by which it had been betrayed. He had predicted the catastrophe of fascism while the official communist movement was still calling social democracy the main enemy. He had been murdered for his trouble. The problem, which is really many problems wrapped inside each other, goes something like this. How do you make a revolution without creating the conditions for its betrayal? How do you build an organization capable of disciplined action without building the hierarchies that will eventually use that discipline against the people it was meant to serve? How do you maintain the revolutionary commitment of a movement over the years and decades during which the revolution does not happen? How do you keep the idea of human liberation alive in a world that persistently demonstrates the human capacity for domination? Trotsky's answers to these questions were, in retrospect, insufficient. He believed that the degeneration of the Russian Revolution was essentially a product of historical circumstances, of isolation, of backwardness, of the failure of revolution in the advanced countries, rather than of structural problems in the revolutionary project itself. He believed that the correct revolutionary program and the correct revolutionary party, if they could be built on sufficiently firm foundations, would be capable of avoiding the mistakes of the Bolsheviks. He believed this with a conviction that did not fully integrate the evidence that the very organizational model he was defending had contributed to the disaster he was describing. This is not to say that he was wrong about everything. He was right about the nature of Stalinism at a time when most of the left was either defending it or ignoring it. He was right about the danger of fascism. He was right that capitalism's crises would continue and deepen. He was right that the suppression of workers' democracy, whether by capitalists or by those who claimed to be acting in workers' interests, was incompatible with genuine human liberation. These were not small things to be right about. But he was also the man who had suppressed the Kronstadt rebellion, the revolt of the sailors who had been among the most committed defenders of the revolution in 1917, who rose up in 1921 demanding free Soviets, freedom of speech, freedom of the press for socialist parties, and the end of the party's monopoly on political life. Trotsky's role in crushing that rebellion, in ordering the attack on sailors who were demanding exactly the kind of democratic freedoms he himself would later champion, is a biographical fact that his admirers have always found difficult to accommodate. He argued at the time that the circumstances made it necessary. He never fully recanted that position. He was the man who had theorized brilliantly and correctly the mechanisms by which revolutionary parties substitute themselves for the class, and who had participated in the early stages of exactly that substitution. He was the man who had predicted Hitler's rise when the Communist International was dismissing the Social Democrats as the greater threat, and who had spent years in the Communist International himself, defending positions that contributed to the left's weakness. He was a figure of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary contradictions, who diagnosed the disease more clearly than almost anyone, and who carried some of the disease in his own political body. This is perhaps what makes him so durable as a historical figure. He is not a saint, and the hagiographic tradition in Trotskyism that treats him as one does his memory no service. He is not simply a villain, and the Stalinist tradition that reduced him to an agent of imperialism is historical falsification. He is a human being of remarkable intelligence and genuine moral commitment, who was formed by circumstances that none of us would have navigated without contradiction, who saw more clearly than most, and acted on what he saw with a courage that ultimately cost him everything: his family, his country, his life. The question he kept asking, who benefits from this arrangement, and at whose expense, is still being asked. It is being asked by workers trying to organize in supply chains that span continents. It is being asked by climate scientists watching the economic system he analyzed with such precision continue to treat the planet as an infinite resource and a bottomless dump. It is being asked by the people who live in the consequences of the geopolitical arrangements that his analysis of imperialism tried, not entirely successfully, to explain. He did not give us the answers. He gave us some of the tools for finding them. Whether that is enough, whether it is even the right kind of thing to be looking for, is, appropriately, still being argued about. And that is the story of Leon Trotsky, the man who made a revolution, lost everything he built, and spent his last decade thinking through the ruins. Let's trace the shape of the journey as the night settles and the mind begins to quiet. We began in Yanovka, where a farm boy with a too-fast mind and a restlessness that had no name yet grew up between the flat steppe and the flat horizon, watching a tax collector treat his father with casual contempt, filing the observation away like something he would need later. We followed him to Odessa and Nikolaev, where he encountered Marxism not as a doctrine to be accepted but as a problem to be argued with, and where the arguing eventually persuaded him, as the best arguments do, not through pressure but through the accumulated weight of evidence. We watched him build, from scratch, an illegal workers' organization at 18 and be arrested at 20, and turn the arrest into an education, and turn the education into theory, and turn the theory into one of the most original analyses of revolutionary possibility that the Marxist tradition has produced. We followed him through 1905, when the revolution that everyone had been theorizing suddenly appeared on the streets of Petrograd, and he found himself at 26, at the head of it, and then in a prison cell writing about what it meant, and then escaping across the frozen tundra in a reindeer sledge, because that is the kind of life it was. We followed him through the long émigré years, through Vienna and Paris and New York, through the slow deepening of his theoretical work, through the collapse of the International in 1914, and the long dark patience of waiting for something that might or might not come, and then 1917, when it came. When the man who had theorized permanent revolution lived to watch it begin, when he organized in 50 extraordinary days the seizure of power, and spent the next 4 years building the army that defended it from every direction at once, and stood at the peak of the world's most significant political experiment, and thought perhaps that the thing he had spent his life working toward had been achieved. Then the long defeat, Lenin dying, Stalin moving, the organizational machinery turning against him, the confessions in Moscow naming him as the chief villain of a conspiracy he had never organized, the exile, Turkey, France, Norway, Mexico, each stage more isolated than the last, each stage more dangerous, the losses accumulating steadily, his children, his comrades, the people who had been sent to find him, and then the desk in Coyoacán, and the manuscript about Stalin, and the young man standing behind him. He said, as they were taking him to hospital, that he had been struck by a man to whom he had expressed confidence, that he thought it was a provocation. He wanted his attacker kept alive. He wanted to know what he knew, even then, even in that moment. The question his life keeps asking is not simply about Trotsky. It is about what happens when people of extraordinary conviction and intelligence are given power, and what they do with it, and whether the systems they build to protect their ideas can survive the ideas themselves, and whether the revolution eats its founders or whether the founders do something to deserve being eaten, and whether any of this matters in the face of the suffering that both action and inaction produce. He didn't answer it. Nobody has the answer. If there is one, is probably not the kind that can be stated in a single sentence or derived from a single life. What can be said is this: he saw the gears, he saw them turning, he spent his life trying to understand who built them, who benefits from them, and whether they could be rebuilt differently. He paid the price that people pay for that kind of attention. The desk in Coyoacán is a museum now. The house on the Avenida Vienna, with its high walls and its watchtowers, is open to visitors. You can see the room where he worked, the garden where he kept rabbits, the study where Mercader came with his manuscript and his ice axe. On his desk they have left things as they were: books, papers, the tools of a working life. The window above the desk looks out onto the garden. The garden is quiet, If you've stayed with us all the way to here, thank you. It means a great deal. And once again, an enormous thank you to all our YouTube members and patrons. Your support is the reason these videos exist. If you'd like to join them, you'll find the links in the description below. And if this episode moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover the channel. Until next time, this has been Aphelion. Goodbye.